A lot happens in 30 years, and that is true with Formula One. Today, I'm going to go through from 1990 all the way until 2019, so hopefully you'll learn maybe one thing in this video. No. But it all started with a crash. More specifically, a crash in 1989 between two McLaren teammates who were also championship rivals. No, not those two, or those two. I'm talking about Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. These two were the most intense rivals the sport had probably ever seen. Prost was a smart and calculating driver who could accumulate consistent good results. The downside was that he was French. Senna was definitely the quicker of the two, and would have some races where the rest of the grid looked as if they might as well be driving Formula 2 cars. At the end of 1989, the two had a crash, which ultimately left the championship in Alain Prost's hands, and made Ayrton Senna really pissed off. Prost was also not too happy, thinking that McLaren had been favouring Senna over him, and so for the 1990 Formula 1 season, he left to Ferrari. And this kicks us off with the 90s, with Senna and McLaren winning the first race in Phoenix, Arizona. You might think American street circuits in Formula 1 are bad now. Just take a look at this. Fun fact, the official name of this race was the Drive to and from Walmart Grand Prix. You do have to understand just how big a deal Prost moving to Ferrari was. It had been over a decade since they'd last won a title in 1979 with Jody Scheckter. Kind of like how Ferrari hasn't won anything since 2007 now. Anyway, signing three-time champion Prost was a big deal for not just Ferrari, but the fans. It finally gave them some of that hopium they needed. And with Prost going on to take 5 wins that season, he cemented himself as a title challenger. But before we get on to Senna and his slightly unconventional response this year, there is a lot of car fanboys who wonder why Lamborghini are not involved with Formula 1. If you are between the ages of 12 and 14, you probably love Lamborghini and will be excited to hear that at a point in time, Lamborghini did build Formula 1 engines. In 1990, they supplied Lola, and then would drop out in 1993 after very little success. Stick to tractors, Lamborghini, mate. So let's move on to the title battle, because this year was very close. By the penultimate round in Japan, it was Senna who had the lead, and Prost would need to outscore him to stay in with a chance of securing the title. They lined up 1-2 on the starting grid, and then this happened.
Trying to go through on the inside, and it's happened immediately. This is amazing.
Senna drove into Prost, took them both out, and therefore was given the title. And then despite me slagging them off literally 1 second ago, the Lamborghini-powered Lola took 3rd place in this race. I take it back. Come back to F1 Lamborghini. Senna would later admit in 1991 that he did purposely drive into Prost. There's a lot of talk about fraudulent champions in F1. If you ever wanted one to get behind, here he is. Sometimes I like to sit back and wonder what F1 Twitter would have been like after this race. Prost is the rightful world champion, no? Senna must die.
What the hell?
At FP1Will, #expel end of the week. This won't be the last time we talk about intentional crashing and fraudulent champions in the 90s, but let's quickly take a look at 1991 first. In terms of the championship, a less exciting year. McLaren and Senna were by far the best driver and car combination, with no crashes needed to secure the title this time round. There were some other more interesting developments though. It's about time we mention the man with the best mustache in motorsport, and F1 YouTuber not applicable James's greatest driver of all time, Nigel Mansell, baby. Mansell had actually been the one who partnered Prost at Ferrari in 1990. He probably suffered through 1 pit stop and decided to go back to Williams for 1991, who were clearly this year the 2nd best team. And it was Mansell who finished in P2 in the championship behind Senna. Ferrari, meanwhile, were so bad, Alain Prost got dropped for the last round in Adelaide because he wouldn't stop calling the car a piece of shit in the media. It's hilarious because things really do never change with this red team, do they? Speaking of the Italian team, something interesting did happen at the Italian Grand Prix. Michael Schumacher, racing for Jordan, scored his first points. Although he'd made his debut a race earlier in Belgium, with a very impressive qualifying session, his clutch had given out on lap 1. But after scoring points in Italy, the rest of Schumi's 91 season went on to solidify him as something special to look out for the rest of the decade. And I'm sure we're going to talk about him a lot more in the near future. For now, though, we need to get back to the mustache man, Mansell, because 1992 was about to be his year. Williams had made a car that went up and down. I know cars are meant to go forwards and backwards, sometimes even side to side. But up and down, what is this wizardry? Well, this is active suspension, and it allowed Williams to optimize their ride height throughout a lap. It would be shamelessly stolen by Mercedes years later to make terrible memes. Despite the Williams being the fastest car, never write off Ayrton Senna, who held his own against Mansell when he raced him, but suffered from poor reliability for the whole season. It made sense Senna was still winning races. The man liked his lap times as low as possible, his speed as high as possible, and his girlfriends as young as possible. Ayrton did have one big complaint throughout the season, aside from losing the title to Nigel. He found the year boring without his old rival Alan Prost. If you are Mansell, that must hurt your feelings because you can win the title and still not be doing enough for Senna. Thankfully, he was in luck. Prost was coming back.
I always come back.
Replacing old Nige at Williams for the 1993 season. Meanwhile, Mansell was off to IndyCar. Ew, America. Goodbye, every single one of my viewers. Look, I'll balance it out with an obligatory England has terrible food, weather, and teeth. So subscribe for me to have just 1 ounce of joy in this country. Before we do move on to 1993, quick shout out my boy Michael Schumacher. He had moved to the Benetton F1 team this year, took his first win at Spa. We call that Redemption Day for Michael. All right, 1993, Senna versus Prost, back for one final time. It's going to be intense, it's going to be crazy, things are going to be dramatic and wild, and Prost won by 26 points. You know, Senna was there or thereabouts. They had some battles, but the Williams, with all of its advanced driver aids and its active suspension, it was the clear best car, so it was always going to be Prost's championship to lose. 93 did see a completely new lineup for Williams, with the former Patrese-Mansell lineup now becoming a team consisting of Alan Prost and Damon Hill. Prost was once again set to retire, so who would partner the young Damon for 1994? Ayrton bloody Senna. Okay, so Damon is definitely not winning this world title. For 1994, the FIA had realized Williams had all of these advanced driver aids, and the car had become too dominant for their liking. So they decided to change the rules and remove them all, making the car Senna and Hill had to drive at the start of that season very difficult, with Senna failing to finish the first 2 rounds of the season, whereas Benetton's Schumacher won both of them. By round 3, the pressure was on. I'm sure you know the story. Senna's car failed, or if you're a conspiracy theorist, he was shot. And after colliding with the wall, he passed away. This left Williams and Damon Hill in a bit of a pickle. Their star driver was gone, but they still had a championship they could realistically fight for.
¿Quieres?
So with both David Coulthard and Nigel Mansell filling in Senna's role for a couple of rounds each, Damon tried his absolute best to bring the fight to Michael Schumacher, who had built up a big championship lead. Thankfully for Hill, as the year went on, the Williams car improved, with Damon being able to secure more and more wins. By the final round, there was a gap of just 1 point. Michael ahead of Damon. And in the closing stages of the final race, Hill was catching him. Michael's title was under threat. Then this happened. Michael and Damon had crashed, ending both of their races. Again, I would have absolutely killed for F1 Twitter to have existed at this point. In my opinion, this was on purpose from Michael. We'll get onto why I think that later on. To the FIA, it was nothing more than
just an incident on the race.
So Schumacher was handed the title, and Hill was left not only traumatized by the death of his teammate, but now mentally destroyed by his main rival. And in about 4 months, he was going to have have to go through all of that again. 1995 came around quick, with Hill once again being partnered by young Minecraft Steve. No, sorry, Will N.E. Shit, no, David Coulthard. I got all my square-headed people mixed up. My bad. Williams that year had by far the best car. But Schumacher was, of course, locked in because he's Schumacher. Meanwhile, Damon was basically fighting for his life. On track, things were not going well. He was making dumb mistake after dumb mistake after dumb mistake, throwing away easy points. Off track, he was still dealing with the fact his teammate had died in a car he was driving, and Michael had also well and truly got under his skin and was playing mind games with him. All the while, the Williams team just kept growing increasingly frustrated that Hill wasn't performing in a car he realistically should breeze to the championship with. By the time Schumacher had the title wrapped up for 1995,
That's too easy!
Frank Williams had informed Damon Hill that next year would be his last season with the team. He had to make it count. 1996, Williams was even better. Hill had worked through some of his personal problems. Two-time champion Schumacher had also left to Ferrari in an attempt to bring them back to the top, just like Prost in 1990, Lewis Hamilton now, Sebastian Vettel in 2015, Fernando Alonso in 2010. The list goes on. Damon even had a new rookie teammate, albeit a rookie who was also IndyCar world champion. But with all of this going in his favor, Damon Hill still nearly lost to Jacques Bloody Villeneuve. Thankfully for him, Damon secured the title this year. Finally, he could rest easy now. Well done, Damon.
And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.
As discussed before, Hill was dropped, and in came German driver and criminally underrated Heinz-Harald Frentzen. In 97, it would be Jacques Villeneuve who was the Williams team leader. I don't like Jacques Villeneuve. He annoys me. And overall, he wasn't too great of a driver. However, throughout 96 and 97, he was pretty good. Even I have to admit that as a hater, whether he thinks F1 cars should have wing mirrors or not. Idiot. He wouldn't have it easy though, because Michael Schumacher had began transforming that Ferrari team. They were on the up, and the fight between him and Villeneuve was absolutely on. Into the final race, Michael once again led the title by just 1 point. And once again, when his rival tried to overtake him, he did this. This time it backfired. Not only did Michael fail to take Villeneuve out, he took himself out too, therefore losing valuable points. It didn't end there either. This was the third time this decade two drivers had come together in what was very obviously an intentional crash. And it was the second time it involved Michael Schumacher. The FIA was going to have to take action even if F1 Twitter didn't exist yet. And so despite Villeneuve winning the title anyway, Michael was handed a disqualification from the championship for his actions, and that's why I believe 94 was almost certainly on purpose as well. Other news from 1997 was that Adrian Newey moved from Williams to McLaren. If you're wondering why you've never heard me mention a driver called Adrian Newey before, that's because he's not one. He's an aerodynamicist and designer, and he'd been responsible for designing the dominant Williams we'd just been looking at. He's also the guy who designed the recent Red Bulls that have won basically everything, until he left and McLaren caught up. What's very interesting is that in 1998, for some reason, Williams were no longer the fastest team, and McLaren was. I'm just giving you some context as to why that is. Ferrari was also still sandwiched in there in second. Next year is our year, I guess. There was a title fight between Michael Schumacher in Ferrari and Mika Hakkinen in McLaren, but again, it was pretty clear McLaren was simply just better. My favorite part of 1998 is actually one very specific race. The absolute chaos that unfolded during the Belgian Grand Prix. Firstly, the start looked like this. And then because this was at a point where teams had a spare third car, a bunch of drivers just could get in those and carry on after a red flag restart. The race continued with a bit less carnage, and Michael Schumacher was leading by a billion miles. All until he smashed into the back of David Coulthard's McLaren while he was attempting to lap him. Michael saw this as a personal attack, which prompted him to try and rip the man's throat out when they were back in the pit lane. That's not even the best part. The best part is that Damon Hill in Jordan went on to win the race 1-2 with teammate Ralf Schumacher. To put that in modern F1 terms would be a bit like Haas winning a race 1-2. Absolutely crazy business. Anyway, let's move on to 1999 because this decade ends with a bang. Ferrari looked like they were going to win the title, but the problem was they were going to win it with the wrong driver. At the British Grand Prix, Michael Schumacher had done this and broke his legs. I mean, that was pretty much it for Michael. His season was over. He had to sit out almost all of the races. But for his teammate Eddie Irvine, nothing was over. Things were close. Irvine would pull out a win only for Hakkinen in the McLaren to respond the next week. But it was at the Nürburgring where everything fell apart for Eddie. How, you ask? Well, Ferrari did a Ferrari. They forgot my man's fucking tires. How do you call someone in for a pit stop and forget the one thing you need to do? Albeit refueling still existed, but dickheads, man, dickheads. Some would argue this was intentional by Ferrari, as the team wanted Schumacher to be the champion and not Irvine. I argue the Italian team couldn't organize a haircut, never mind sabotage. In the last race of the season, Michael, who had returned at this point, gapped Irvine by 95 seconds to finish ahead of him in P2 in the race, but Mika's win was enough to take the title whether Irvine was in P3 or P2. Ferrari would just have to wait until next year.
So going into 2000, Ferrari was starting to get concerned. I mean, there's only so much the managers are going to put up with when the results aren't being delivered. They'd hired on Michael Schumacher in 1996 and hadn't received the results they wanted since that time. Especially considering going into that, they built the whole team around Schumacher, so they expected him to perform. In 2000, the battle was fierce between Hakkinen and Schumacher, with the penultimate round being where Michael actually managed to take the championship finally for the Ferrari team, and that would secure his third World Drivers' Championship and his first for Ferrari. Italians all over the world that day drank wine, partied, and told people they were eating food wrong because they invented it. F you Italians, I love Ferrari, but I am putting garlic mayo on my pizza. Thank you very much. 2000 also wasn't without its controversy, as during the Italian Grand Prix that year, we suffered the death of a marshal. A bit of a reminder that despite the racing being close and really fun to watch, it still wasn't of the safety standard we would expect. As heading into the second chicane at Monza, Frentzen collided with an Arrows car, his wheel came loose and it struck one of the marshals who was standing at his post, which killed him instantly. So of course, after something like this, F1 had to review its safety standards as it's just unacceptable to be happening. So let's see what happened moving into 2001. In terms of the title fight, it wasn't really that spectacular, nothing as exciting as 2000. Mika Hakkinen had a pretty poor year, finishing quite far off teammate David Coulthard, who was the closest rival Michael Schumacher had, but the McLarens couldn't really match the Ferraris this season. In 2001, the Twin Towers said bye-bye to everybody, so at the Italian Grand Prix that year, some tributes were made. A race which, incidentally, Williams would go on to win with Juan Pablo Montoya. And at that time, former IndyCar driver who'd moved to F1 with actually quite a lot of promise. So just remember that name for a little bit later on. And now let's also talk about my main man, Fernando Goat Alonso. There he is. What do you have to say, Fernando?
Ia beber slowly poisoning you with carbon monoxide.
What the fuck? Now, in 2001, this goat right here, he made his F1 debut. And he was driving for a team called Minardi, which, if you don't know, were absolutely awful. I mean, seriously, you'd be better off putting a pedal bike on the grid and trying to race the other teams. They were just atrocious. Alonso's best results were to finish 2 laps down from everybody else, as his worst results were just the car blowing up before the end of the race, which happened quite a lot. Now, every time, though, I go to talk about Fernando Alonso's rookie season, I'm reminded of this weird conspiracy that I found out. Basically, if you go to F1.com, they have a list of every single race result ever with all the teams, all the drivers that took part in the championship. Sounds simple enough. But if we go back to the race results of 2001, Alonso, his teammate, and Minardi are not listed on the drivers' or constructors' standings. I mean, if you look at the races, they're there. They're listed as finished. Minardi Minardi, Alonso, everything is normal there. But I have no idea why they aren't on the constructors or drivers standings. I mean, as far as I know, they weren't disqualified that season, but even if they were, F1 tends to still leave you listed. For example, Michael Schumacher in 1997 or McLaren in 2007, which we'll get to. It still lists them on the standings. If you do actually know the reason as to why this might be, please put it down in the comments because I'm really curious. Otherwise, I'll just send my ass over to the Joe Rogan podcast. Anyway, Alonso performed pretty well that season considering he was in a go-kart. So for 2002, he was given the Renault reserve seat in preparation to move him up to the main team. Oh yeah, in 2001, we also had another Marshall death. Oh wait, that's not really a good thing, is it? Yeah, this time a wheel flew off Jacques Villeneuve's BAR car and struck a Marshall during the Australian Grand Prix. 2 deaths in 2 years, honestly, even at that time was completely unacceptable for Formula One. F1 actually started to crack down on the wheels being able to fall off the cars in a crash. And that's why after these incidents, even to this day, you'll see whenever an F1 car crashes, there always has to be something keeping that wheel attached, as they are one of the most dangerous parts of the F1 car that can go flying off. Anyway, moving into 2002, Michael Schumacher had an absolutely incredible run of form. Honestly, this season was so strong from him, it rivals Max Verstappen's 2023 year. He became the first and currently only driver to ever finish on the podium in every single race of a season during 2002, which means he got to drink an awful lot of champagne. I bet Kimi Raikkonen was jealous. That year, though, Williams were definitely the second best car behind Ferrari, with Juan Pablo Montoya third in the standings behind the 2 Ferrari drivers, and Michael's brother Ralf Schumacher in 4th. Then McLaren followed in the constructors with the 3rd best car, although on paper they probably had the fastest, if not the 2nd fastest car over the whole season. It's just the problem McLaren had was that their car exploded every 2 seconds, especially in the hands of Mika Häkkinen's replacement, Kimi Raikkonen, who does at this point sound like the Aldi knockoff version of Mika Häkkinen. Trust me, it's just because they're both Finnish, but they are both big personalities in the sport and very different.
Kimi, what happened?
I spun.
But Raikkonen drove the absolute balls off the car, which meant that by the end of the race, the balls had actually fallen off the car and it wouldn't finish. With Raikkonen and Juan Pablo Montoya, both a little bit hotheads at the time, being so close on track, it gave us amazing radio messages, such as this one.
Fucking Raikkonen! What a fucking idiot!
Which was when F1, I think, realized they probably shouldn't broadcast the radios live. Moving into next year, though, 2003 was an incredible season I still wasn't born for. You had a 3-way title fight between the defending world champion Michael Schumacher, the man who says so little his tongue might as well have been cut off, Kimi Raikkonen, and the Colombian hothead, likely sampling his country's biggest export, Juan Pablo Montoya. This season, though, also saw the maiden win of Goat Alonso himself. Well done, Fernando. What do you remember about 2003?
I accidentally crashed the F1 car into an nursing home but don't tell anyone.
Alonso had replaced Jenson Button at Renault, as Button was fired for being too much of an eccentric playboy, which is definitely not how he would be described now. He's probably now thought of as one of the most chill drivers on the grid. Or in fact, actually no, he's Danica Patrick's worst enemy.
Long run down here into turn 1. Obviously, this is fast section here.
Right, so let's talk about who the championship challengers were. Firstly, we're starting with Montoya, who, despite a good start to the season and definitely had an extremely fast car under him, managed to make so many mistakes, he put himself out of contention
Very wide. Oh! Whoa!
early on. Montoya really is just me trying to do the F1 game with no flashbacks enabled.
It's Michael Schumacher!
What the fuck was that?
So anyway, with Juan Pablo crashing out of contention, let's talk about our two other drivers. Defending champ Schumacher and drunk Finn Kimi Räikkönen. McLaren this season had a car very much close to Ferrari on pace, with it really just coming down to circuit-specific setups to decide who had the best pace. Kimi again suffered from his reliability though, although much less than in 2002, taking just 3 DNFs this year. And can I just remind you, 3 almost definitely felt like a blessing in comparison to the 2002 season, where he finished just 6 races and DNF'd in 11 of them. At that point, you might as well stop turning up to the races and just go eat ice cream on your yacht. Oh, he actually did do that after his engine blew up. Anyway, in comparison, Schumacher suffered just 1 DNF, which was during the chaos of the 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix.
No! 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 Fuck!
And if you would like me to summarize that race, here is Fernando Alonso trying to drive.
Certainly. So, Martin, I have to interrupt you because the Jordan team are bouncing up and down in the pit lane. We're looking at the images there of that incident of Alonso.
Genuinely, at the time, that was a really scary crash, though, for the drivers, and it was a bit of a chaotic race. The race win was actually given to Kimi Räikkönen, but we then found out that was the wrong person to give the win to, and the actual winner was Giancarlo Fisichella. Due to a timing error, the FIA had got it wrong, so Räikkönen had to give Fisichella the trophy back at the next race. It's pretty funny. Anyway, despite Schumacher's pretty poor finish in the last race of the season, he managed to finish just ahead of Räikkönen by 2 points in the standings.
I don't know, we got second place again. It's not very nice to finish second almost every time, but we were just not quick enough this year to win the title, and at least we didn't lose for bad driver.
If Kimi Räikkönen was capable of showing any emotion whatsoever, he probably would have done this face. No! But knowing him, he likely got drunk and collapsed on someone's shoes.
Well, he wasn't drinking in a bar, but he was in Monaco and he was standing in a bar. And then somebody collapsed, drunk, on his feet.
Yeah, it was me.
Yeah.
2004! What an excellent year, because yours truly, Dan No Skill, was finally alive and breathing in this world. But also, for Ferrari, this was a brilliant year, because let me tell you something about Italian engineering. I am convinced that they're probably so drunk on red wine all of the time, the Italians don't really know how to build a Formula 1 car. They probably just throw shit at the wall and hope it goes fast. Going into 2004, Ferrari began work on the F2004, which is going to be their car to compete with for the season. They were expecting maybe a couple seconds at most, or a few tenths, on their 2003 designers. It wasn't a big regulation change. So when the engineers saw the first lap of the F2004, they checked that their stopwatches were working properly because of how fast it was. The F2004 was, in fact, that fast. And to this day, it still holds some of the speed records within Formula 1, which shows just how incredible of a car it really was. At the end of 2004, Ferrari looked unstoppable. But as always, the French were about to come in and ruin everything. Well, at least if you were a Ferrari fan. Fernando Alonso, Lord Alonso himself, 2005 was the year of Alonso. And of course, the French outfit of Renault. We're used to seeing Fernando as the oldest rookie on the grid. But during this point in his career, Alonso was genuinely seen as the young man in Formula 1. In fact, in 2005, he became the youngest Formula 1 world champion ever at that point. It's now Sebastian Vettel who holds that title, with Lewis Hamilton in second and Alonso in third. But at the time, Alonso was very, very young for a world champion, evidently. His main rival for 2005 was, of course, McLaren's Kimi Räikkönen, who many during this period saw as the best driver on the grid, or at least the quickest. Probably how a lot of us imagine Charles Leclerc now. Extremely quick over a race and one lap, but maybe just doesn't have the look or the car under him to be a world champion yet.
I am stupid.
Kimi did manage to overtake Alonso this season, just sadly for him whilst Alonso was going for a run.
Look, they are running.
It's Alonso, isn't it?
They don't get cars from Renault today.
But he couldn't overtake him in the standings. Many would argue that Raikkonen had a lot of bad luck during this period. Well, although when they do tell you these stats, they heavily weight it on that 2002 season, which I'll admit was god-awful. But at the end of the day, Renault did just seem to have the better car, and Alonso drove extremely well that season. The biggest shock was honestly Ferrari. Michael Schumacher was definitely best of the rest if you exclude Renault and McLaren. He was about 7 F2004s away from actually being able to touch the World Championship trophy. And after the last 5 years of utter dominance, it was hard for a lot of people to believe that Ferrari had gone this far down. Truly, the Italians would have to eat so much spaghetti to overcome their pain this time. But could Michael Schumacher bounce back to please the Tifosi in 2006? Well, it's Michael Schumacher. Of course he could. In 2006, he really gave Fernando a run for his money. And Alonso had to be a lot smarter about how he was going to win his race. But hold on! I forgot to mention an incredibly sad death that happened this year. 2006 was the death of the V10 engine. The screaming, piercing, deafening your grandma when you watch the TV noise of the V10 engine was no longer in 2006. And instead, this year, engines were replaced with V8s. Well, apart from Toro Rosso, because basically they were Minardi in 2005, and Minardi were going bankrupt, so they went to FIA and were like, please let us run a V10 for 2006. We have no money. And the FIA were like, okay. But then Toro Rosso bought Minardi for 2006, and the agreement was kept, so Toro Rosso actually ran a V10 engine. So I suppose 2007 was the real death of the V10. Anyway, Alonso and Schumacher had some incredible battles, while it was actually McLaren who lagged behind a little bit this year. But when I think of this season, I always come back to one race between Michael and Fernando. And it was where Fernando was acting like the Great Wall of China and refusing to let Michael Schumacher past. In what was honestly a brilliant defense, and probably how Alonso learned to do it for Hungary 2021 against Hamilton. It was during a race at Imola in 2006, and still I can't believe Alonso came out on top. For fuck's sake, I can't say that. What is it with F1 words and always sounding so suspicious?
So Liuzzi gets a fair enough start, but he's already got Massa coming inside him.
Alonso edged out Michael Schumacher. You know what? Forget it. Alonso won the championship. And with that, Michael announced his retirement, hung up his racing boots, and left the sport. At least for the rest of the 2000s. He came back in 2010. You know what else happened in 2006? My man, Jensen, the first driver to hit the DRS button, won his first ever race.
Because here, in his 113th Grand Prix start, he's proved the critics wrong. They said he might never win a Grand Prix. He's done it! Jensen Button wins the Hungarian Grand Prix!
2007 was a relatively uneventful season. There was just a couple things like Spygate, Hamilton versus Alonso, and Raikkonen replacing Schumacher. Oh, fuck me, this wasn't an uneventful season, was it? As we head into the latter half of the 2000s, I'm gonna quickly ask for your subscription because, Jesus Christ, if you can put up with me yapping for this long, you might as well just subscribe and watch the rest of my videos because you are some kind of insane person. I'm also going to quickly thank all of these guys, the channel members who massively help support the channel, and you can do the same from just 99p a month. It really does help me out, so thank you so much to everyone who's done it. Let's start though with 2007's driver transfers because, as you can imagine, Michael Schumacher's retirement changed a lot. Kimi Raikkonen was to be the German's successor. Once his biggest rival over at McLaren, now the one to fill his shoes. What a lovely story. McLaren themselves would have a whole new lineup of reigning world champion Fernando Alonso and a rookie. And you know, a rookie and a world champion always makes sense because the rookie is not going to be putting pressure on the champion is going to be able to take the lead. And oh, fuck me, it's Lewis Hamilton, isn't it? Oh, God. Okay, so the insanely talented and with a lot of testing under his belt, Lewis Hamilton, was going to be the one to partner Fernando Alonso. And he was well and truly up to speed by the start of the season, so Fernando was going to have to watch out. Now, I may have just told you that Lewis and Fernando were driving for McLaren, but some in the comments might be saying they actually drove for Ferrari. This is because of a teeny tiny, absolutely enormous scandal called Spygate, where a McLaren engineer was found to be stealing classified falsified Ferrari documents, and therefore he was fired and McLaren were disqualified from the Constructors' Championship. Luckily, the car was found to have contained no Ferrari elements, believe that if you will, and Hamilton and Alonso were still able to take part in the Drivers' Championship and retain all of their points. Sorry, but has the season even started yet? Ferrari took 3 out of the first 5 race victories, and Fernando took 2. But then, going into Canada, Lewis took his maiden victory, and he won the next round in the USA. As Lewis improved, and Fernando, mate, you might want to cover your ears for this because you're going to get PTSD, the McLaren team appeared to support the Brit more and more in his challenge for the championship. And Fernando at least felt that that was unfair. Although Ron Dennis would probably tell you they were treated equally, something he valued at McLaren, for example in the times of Senna and Prost. It all kicked off when someone accused Alonso of handing out bribes to his engineers on his side of the garage. When in fact this has actually been debunked, he was just handing out shares of his podium winnings, something he'd always done throughout his entire career to help motivate his engineers.
No.
And then in Hungary, perhaps the biggest controversy occurred. It was Fernando's turn to have the final run in qualifying, something they alternated between each race, and Lewis Hamilton was given a team order stating exactly that. Yet it was a team order Lewis Hamilton chose to ignore. Therefore, in the pits, Alonso waited and held Lewis Hamilton up.
To Alonso out. Yep, they want him out of there. Now Alonso's not getting on with it. Only a minute and 40 to go. Is he blocking Hamilton here?
Which escalated the situation. Fernando then set off from the pits and managed to make his final qualifying run with a few seconds to spare, whereas Hamilton didn't. This gave Alonso pole position, but he was then handed a 5-place grid penalty, which was given to him for blocking someone in the pit lane. It was for the aforementioned incident, and something again he deemed was quite unfair considering he wasn't blocking anyone but his teammate and he was in his pit box. In the end, honestly, doing that at such a difficult track to pass at probably didn't help Fernando and helped Hamilton more, as Hamilton went on to win the race and Fernando lost out on valuable points to chase him down. Look, it's okay, man. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. It happens to the best of us. But after that, we were off to the home country of only Chinese F1 driver ever, Guangzhou, which was the penultimate round of the season, and Lewis Hamilton was called into the pit lane. It was just for a standard stop to change his tires, but as Lewis pulled into the pits, he shamelessly stole Lance Stroll's strategy from Brazil 2024, 17 years beforehand, and beached his car in the gravel.
Yeah, that's what I would have did. I said earlier, right?
Now, this was mostly because his tires were extremely worn and McLaren had left him out there for quite a long time. It was also probably just with that rookie inexperience, he wouldn't have known how to drive on that kind of tire necessarily yet. It was more a matter of circumstance that Hamilton ended up there. This did give Kimi Raikkonen the race win and gave him valuable points on catching up to Lewis in the championship. I mean, look, there was not a chance with how quick McLaren were, Kimi Raikkonen would ever really win the championship. I mean, going into the final round, he was still 7 points off Hamilton. And this is in a time where race wins only gave you 10 points. If he won it, I would eat my Fernando Alonso cutout behind me. Well, actually, that's a hypothetical I would, because he actually did go and win it, the madman. Raikkonen won the race as Lewis suffered from a small gearbox issue on lap 8 that pushed him back. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't out at that moment because he wasn't driving a French car, so it didn't know it could blow up.
Typical. Why had it done that?
But he would need to recover to 6th in order to win the championship. But this time, he only managed 7th. And with Fernando Alonso in 3rd, the two ended up behind Kimi Raikkonen in the championship. But Lewis and Alonso were tied on points by the end of the season. And you know what? I think Fernando and Lewis being tied on points is honestly the best way to sum up how that season went. They were so busy tripping up over each other and were so close on track, they let Raikkonen slip through the cracks and take what was definitely a well-deserved championship. Anyway, with their relationship as sour as those toxic waste sweets you find in the money-laundering American candy stores, British fans, you will understand, McLaren booted out Fernando Alonso and sentenced him to Renault F1 car for the remainder of his McLaren contract. This is because they didn't want him in any cars that could be anywhere near as competitive as McLaren. That's not a joke or a jab at Renault, that is genuinely the reason as to why. And God, I can't really think of any punishment worse than driving a Renault. On to 2008, at least things would begin to calm down as the season was relatively uneventful. Oh, fuck, it wasn't. At this part of the script writing, I was starting to realize I'd bitten off a bit more than I could chew. But fuck it, I'm this far through, let's just get on with it. This season continued the McLaren and Ferrari rivalry we'd enjoyed watching through the entirety of the 2000s pretty much.
But there should be a skibbity thrashing for such insolence as this.
And for decades before in Formula 1. Hamilton and Heikki Kovalainen, a pretty unremarkable driver, thank God, and I actually mean it this time, would make the McLaren lineup, whereas reigning world champion Kimi Räikkönen and Felipe Massa were the ones who were representing Ferrari. Now, you would assume the title battle would go down again between Räikkönen and Lewis Hamilton, but you may be surprised to hear Felipe Massa, someone who'd been pretty much thwarted by Kimi the year before, was going to be the one putting up a fight this season. Now, many F1 fans just chalk this up to Kimi Räikkönen being hungover from his celebrations of world champion the year before and not really caring as much as to how he did in 2008.
It's more like a hobby for me, so obviously I don't need to do it if I don't want.
But it was all really because of something called Santander Gate. I promise you there is just one more gate after this and then we're done. I really do promise. So around the Monaco Grand Prix of 2008, there began some rumors of big boy Fernando over here fancying the Ferrari seat. Who could really blame him? And McLaren's 2007 sponsor, Santander, were a little bit unhappy that the Spanish driver they wanted to represent had been dropped prematurely. You know, they were a Spanish bank, they wanted to back a Spanish driver like Alonso. By the way, I have already done a deep dive on this story, so if you want to know the real ins and outs of it, you can watch this video here, but this is just going to be a brief summary. Santander were also about to undergo a huge expansion into the Brazilian market. So what better way for them to promote that than to sponsor a Brazilian Formula 1 driver also? You know, someone such as Felipe Massa. So what better way to make everybody happy than to offer Ferrari a fuckload of money to have an Alonso Massa lineup in a deal that could be worth billions in exposure within the Brazilian market. So during the season, Ferrari began to slowly sabotage Räikkönen's season, only by a little bit, to hinder his performance. And then they would push him out of the team and bring Fernando Alonso in. So that's why Felipe Massa is our title challenger. Yeah, no one said it was going to be a short story, did they? Anyways, let's talk about some actual racing this season, and let's start with Spa. Lewis Hamilton had taken the checkered flag first, but was handed a controversial 25-second penalty for an illegal overtake.
Touch. Hamilton will have to give the corner back. They're side by side. He'll have to have a go at him at last source. Play it cool, but it went wrong for him. Hamilton's through. They touch again. Amazing action here.
Thank God F1 Twitter didn't exist in these days, or it would have been a hell site for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And it already is a hell site. But going into Singapore, Felipe Massa really needed a good result until, of course, crashgate. This is my final gate, unless you want a video on fucking Watergate. At the Singapore Grand Prix, Renault were a little bit fed up with being mid and fancied actually winning something for a change. So during the race, the team unexpectedly pitted Fernando quite early on. And then, rather conveniently, their other driver slammed into the wall, which brought out the safety car, and with Alonso leading the pack after a bunch of pit stop chaos, he was in first. And after that, he then went on to win the race. Okay, so the race was fixed. That was obvious. And they did a pretty shitty job of hiding it when Piquet Jr. practiced his crash during the formation lap. Interestingly, the public didn't find out the race was fixed until the year later in 2009. It was more important that during the pit stop phase, Felipe Massa's fuel line had got caught when they were releasing the car, which meant he drove off with it still plugged in, and it cost him a bunch of time to get that removed. And from there, his race was essentially ruined. And that, kids, is why Felipe Massa wants that race discounted from 2008, which would give him the F1 Drivers' World Championship for that year. But that's a whole other story. Going into the Brazilian Grand Prix, it would again be the season finale, and therefore it would decide the fate of the World Championship. Much like last year, Ferrari were on top during the race, and Massa took the race win, and when he crossed the line, Lewis Hamilton was in 6th place. Now this year, Hamilton needed to finish in P5 in order to win the championship, and P6 he would lose it to Massa. Of course, with about 3 corners left and Hamilton in 6th, there was absolutely no possible way he was going to win the championship. The Ferrari garage, rather expectedly, started to celebrate. Then, on the last corner of the last lap, the driver in 5th, Timo Glock, who was on dry tyres, encountered torrential rain, was driving extremely slow, and Lewis Hamilton on wet tyres was able to pass him for 5th place, and therefore the championship.
Slowly. It is, it's gone. Oh my goodness me.
And also spawning my absolute favourite clip ever of a Ferrari driver slamming his head into the wall when he learns the information that Massa didn't win. Goddamn, 2008 was eventful. Let's see what we've got left. Hopefully something quite easy. Oh shit. 2009 was another set of huge regulation changes. And we're definitely a lot closer now to being able to decipher the real impact the 2000s had on Formula 1 and how it changed the sport going into the 2010s. And 2009 really is crucial in that. There's also the fact that between 2008 and 2009, the real, actual important world suffered a huge financial crash. Which, if you don't know, meant that companies weren't quite so willing to throw millions and millions of pounds at Roman Grosjean to crash their cars into walls. It led to quite a few sponsors and teams pulling out of the sport. Such as one example we'll be looking at, which was Honda. But Honda pulling out of the sport started a story that ended pretty insanely. In 2008, Honda's team boss, Ross Brawn, who was also responsible for Michael Schumacher winning all that shit we talked about earlier in the video, yeah, pretty clever guy, he told Honda in 2008 to instead focus their resources on the 2009 season, as the new regulations gave them much more of a chance at running near the front. Honda had listened to Brawn's advice, and when they pulled out of the 2009 season, they'd already pretty much built the car ready to run for that year. It just needed an engine. So Ross was like, "Oi, Honda mate, since you've pulled out like a sell us the company for £1 and I'll run it instead." And Honda just said, okay. And I'm not joking when I said £1, which for all of you Americans who watch my videos means £1 Great British pound. Honda really sold the team to Brawn for just that, making the team the now all-new constructor Brawn GP. Now Ross again tried to bargain with Honda, asking them pretty please can they supply the engines, as again it was something they'd already nearly finished. But this time Honda said no. Fuck you, said Ross Brawn, who was actually the fuck you guy, and instead managed to get an engine deal with Mercedes, even though the car's chassis wasn't built to accommodate that engine. All of the teams did also pip in a little bit to help try and keep Brawn alive during the off-season, in a bit of a coming together we'd never really before seen in Formula 1. That's probably because they didn't expect Brawn to do what they did next. With a driver lineup of Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello, Brawn absolutely dominated the start of the season. Over were the days of Ferrari and McLaren. They were the new top dogs. 6 of the first 7 race victories went to Jenson Button, and just 1 went to the man who proved to be his closest rival, a young man named Sebastian Vettel, who was driving for an energy drink. Yep, this was also the year that Red Bull really started to come into their own. Goodbye McLaren and Ferrari, hello Brawn and heart palpitations in a can. However, with the limited budget, the Brawn car really started to fall to pieces. And when I say fall to pieces, I mean mean in the literal sense. During a race in Hungary, a part of the Brawn car of Rubens Barrichello, a spring, flew out from the back and struck Felipe Massa in the head. It literally pierced through his helmet, and had it been a millimeter in the wrong direction, he would have died instantly. Thankfully, Felipe Massa did survive the ordeal, but had to sit out the remainder of the season. In the metaphorical sense, Brawn's car also did continue to fall apart, because they just didn't have the budget to bring the upgrades teams like Red Bull could. And after Jenson Button's winning streak, the team could only manage 2 more wins with Rubens Barrichello. Jenson, my friend I'm going to pee in Fernando's seat Button, was clearly also starting to feel the pressure of potentially being a world champion.
Lando, we can be world champion, I said. Please, Lando. Lando!
As some poor results actually began to allow Vettel to close the gap towards him. However, in the penultimate round of the season, which was again Brazil, Button drove an absolutely phenomenal race to go from 15th
16
to 5th, and that allowed him to well and truly wrap up the Drivers' World Championship. And Brawn became the first ever team to win the Constructors and Drivers' World Championship in their first year of asking. The only other time that's been possible was when I set the AI to 0 on my F1 2023 My Team career mode, even though Pastor Maldonado wasn't much fucking help as a teammate. But 2009, in an almost poetic way, set up for what the 2010s would be like.
The 2010s, a time when everyone had those weird galaxy backpacks, troll faces were still funny, and a Formula 1 world champion was yet to hit the griddy or say hot to. Many would call them simpler times. But in the F1 world, we were about to undergo some of the biggest changes in the history of the sport. But before we do that, we must first start with an energy drink. Sometimes I forget Red Bull actually sells drinks, because most of the time they're getting someone to skateboard in the sky or like jump off a bridge. For some reason, this actually works in selling their drinks. And by 2010, Red Bull had a fully established Formula 1 team. Actually, they had 2, but you don't really need to know about that. And for the 2010 season, you may argue Red Bull were actually the favourites for the World Championship, considering in 2009, their driver Sebastian Vettel had very narrowly missed out on winning, only losing to Jenson Button, who was driving a Brawn, which after 2009 had become Mercedes, and for the rest of the decade, you may want to remember the Mercedes team. Of course, there's one team you can never write off in Formula 1, the Italians, or more specifically, Ferrari. Ferrari are iconic, euphoric, and occasionally moronic, but it was rumored for the 2010 season they had a pretty decent car, and driving that car was a pretty decent driver. Fernando Alonso! Yeah, it's actually this guy right here. The cardboard cutout who watches me sleep and occasionally touches me inappropriately. Fernando Goat Alonso. By 2010, this man was already a Formula 1 legend. He had 2 world championships under his belt, fighting against Kimi Raikkonen and Michael Schumacher, 2 of the best in the sport. In 2007, he'd gone toe-to-toe with Lewis Hamilton, and, well, actually, Raikkonen won that. We don't talk about that one. And in 2008, he'd won the Singapore Grand Prix after his team fixed the race and cheated. Yeah, we don't talk about that one either. As always in Formula 1, you also can't count out people's teammates. Apart from Alonso's teammate, Felipe Massa. He was a bit arse. But over in Red Bull, Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel's teammate, he was also a very capable driver who looked like, on his day, maybe he could win a championship. Mathematically speaking, Lewis Hamilton was also in with a realistic chance of the championship this year, but it would have been very unrealistic for him to actually win it by the final round of the season. So for now, we're going to put him in the stinky corner and he can come out in a few years. But to start off the decade, Fernando Alonso won the season opener. And despite only actually winning 4 more races after that for the entire year, by the final race of the season, Fernando Alonso had an 8-point lead over second place, who was Mark Webber. You may be surprised to hear that Sebastian Vettel was not the driver in second place at this point, considering he'd been the closest out of the lot of them to the 2009 title. But like I said, never write off a Mark Webber. So how did the final race go? Did my boy Fernando clench a race win to take the championship? No. No, of course he didn't. Sebastian Vettel qualified on pole with Lewis Hamilton in second and Fernando in third. If the result had stayed like that, my boy Fernando would have won the title. Unfortunately, Ferrari pulled a move they'd become somewhat famous for and made an odd strategy call, pitting Fernando later on in the race after there was an early safety car and directly behind some traffic he was going to have to get through. Move! However, he just couldn't get through it. At the time, the Abu Dhabi circuit was even more toe cheese than it is nowadays, as Kimi Raikkonen puts it.
What do you think of the Abu Dhabi circuit? Well, you said the first few turns are quite good, but the rest of it is shit.
And Renault's Vitaly Petrov managed to hold off Alonso for a billion laps until the end of the race, despite Petrov being on older tyres. And therefore, Vettel breezed to victory, making up the 15-point deficit he had going into that race, and giving us a very iconic team radio.
Du bist Weltmeister! Thank you, boy! Sebastian Vettel, you are the world champion!
And I'm sure Fernando Alonso said something along the lines of, we now move on to 2011, and before the season even began, the sport suffered a huge loss. For the past few years, one driver had been making waves in the lower teams of Formula One, a young chappie from Poland named Robert Kubica. He'd taken his first win a few years earlier in a Sauber, which, despite being better than they were in modern Formula One, was still a little bit like taking a Toyota Prius to the win at the Indy 500. In 2010, Kubica had impressed so much in his Renault, doing amazing overtakes at Singapore with one hand on the wheel just to get some extra speed. I'm not going to bore you with how, but it's basically to do with this airflow device, that he'd been offered a Ferrari contract in 2010 to start in 2012, which of course he'd signed. Who wouldn't have? It is fucking Ferrari. They're red. And red is cool. But during the break between 2010 and 2011, he had a massive rally crash, and that was that. I actually made a full video on Robert's career before and after the crash, and it's really interesting, and the guy is an absolute legend. One of the drivers I still root for today. But for him at the start of 2011, he had a broken hand, so no more jerking off and no more Formula One. Other than that massive loss, the rest of the season felt like business as usual. I mean, Red Bull were much further clear of the grid than they had been in 2010, and they began to favour Sebastian over Mark quite a bit, something Mark had actually pointed out the year before when he won the British Grand Prix.
Fantastic, guys. Not bad for a number 2 driver. Cheers.
And then the Ferrari team were, honestly, I don't know, probably eating pasta.
Super Mario in real life.
I mean, Alonso this time was nowhere near the title. He ended up finishing 4th in the championship, and Jenson Button was the closest to Sebastian Vettel, which, to be fair to Jenson, the first driver to press the DRS button,
long middle name,
he did deserve that, especially after a race in Canada that year, where, I kid you not, Jenson pitted 6 times in one race, fell down to last place at one point, and then on the final lap overtook Vettel,
surprise, motherfucker,
to take the lead and win. If you're gonna watch any races out of the ones I'm mentioning, that one is absolutely baller. Aside from that, 2012 is the far more interesting season because we have another showdown between Fernando Alonso, my goat, and the reigning champ, probably juiced off caffeine, Sebastian Vettel. I am about to state a fact. The Red Bull was the faster car that year, by far. But Alonso, in what was probably one of the best individual performances within Formula One, managed to fight tooth and nail to keep himself within an inch of that championship. And in the final race of the season, Alonso was starting 7th and Vettel was starting 4th, which was not good for the Ferrari man. But whatever Italian gods were looking down on the circuit that day, they blessed him, because on the first lap, Vettel span. Sadly, whatever German gods or caffeine-based gods were also looking down on the circuit that day, they managed to keep Sebastian Vettel from being crashed into during this time of being backwards on the track. How he didn't get in a crash there, I have no idea. So Alonso, yet again outperforming that Ferrari, managed to finish in 2nd place, but Sebastian Vettel also did a really good job to recover from his spin and finish in 4th, which was enough to keep a 3-point lead in the championship, and the whole thing is best summarized by Alonso's painful look to the camera. No! Hopefully this poor run of form isn't foreshadowing for the rest of the 2010s for Ferrari. And right now, Red Bull looked straight up unbeatable, with 2013 being yet another year of Vettel dominance, him even taking the streak for the most races won in a row, although that has since been beat by Max Verstappen in another Red Bull. But change was coming and coming soon. However, before I tell you about the change, how about you change that button to a subscribed button if you haven't already? But let's talk 2014, and more specifically first about the driver changes that have happened. At the start of 2013, McLaren's Lewis Hamilton had decided, actually, f*** you McLaren, I'm going to Mercedes, in a move Jeremy Clarkson described as...
You have moved from McLaren to Mercedes. Is that not a bit like moving from Manchester United to West Ham?
And after a rather unremarkable 2013 season with Mercedes, I'm sure that would all turn into a pile of shit. But also, at the end of 2013, Red Bull's Mark Webber had got fed up of being upside down, or maybe fed up of losing to Vettel more and more and more, and he decided to retire, meaning a guy called Daniel Ricciardo was taking his place. I'm sure nothing out of the ordinary will happen with either of these, so let's see how much Sebastian Vettel was able to win the championship by this year. Mercedes dominance! What I may have forgotten to mention was that 2014 was a huge change in the regulations. F1 was getting rid of the V8 engines, which sounded pretty great, and replaced them with the turbo hybrid V6 engines, which sounded about as pleasant as your granddad falling down the stairs. And Mercedes had built, scientifically speaking, a pretty fucking good engine. Ferrari, meanwhile, had somehow built a car that both understeered and oversteered at the same time, which is basically like having a bike that pedals forwards and backwards simultaneously. Red Bull still had some decent pace, but were nowhere near Mercedes, and for the most part struggled with their engine, as it was only half finished due to the designers being on strike. I wonder which country made that. So the title fight came down between the two Mercedes drivers, Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton. And famously, they were childhood best friends. So it seemed like their relationship would actually end up being relatively stable. Over the next 3 years, their relationship would not be relatively stable. Lewis took the two championships in 2014 and 2015, but Nico Rosberg was not at all happy about it. It got to a point in 2015 where Rosberg was so furious he'd been beaten by Hamilton, he threw Hamilton's winner's cap at him in anger. No wonder he got called Britney, the drama queen.
Happy birthday to you. Yeah. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Britney.
Hamilton also began to dislike Rosberg, accusing him at one point of purposely bringing out the yellow flags during qualifying in Monaco to ruin Lewis's lap and get pole position ahead of him. Of course, that can never be proved, but it's a suspicious lockup. The true breakdown in the relationship came in the 2016 Spanish Grand Prix, where Hamilton and Rosberg, racing each other very hard, had this huge crash, and I can only imagine how many pairs of headphones their team boss Toto Wolff broke. In the end, Rosberg did manage to win the 2016 title after, I kid you not, taking the paint off his helmet to help him go faster by reducing weight. That man was serious, and I can't blame him for, after winning the title, promptly going, yeah, I'm not doing this shit again, and retiring. Well then, that's the whole Brosades saga out of the way, as it's been nicknamed. It's now time to talk about the other teams on the grid during that time, because shit was hitting the fan. What happened to Sebastian Vettel in 2014? He didn't just disappear, but he did score quite a lot less points than his new teammate Daniel Ricciardo, which was a bit surprising, to be honest. Ricciardo had proved himself to be quite a solid driver, even getting a few race wins during that 2014 season, and made the reigning world champion look like nothing. And Vettel, rather cleverly, decided there was no point fighting that and ran away to Ferrari so he could cry. And if things continued like Fernando Alonso's 2014 season, and his 2013 season, and his 2012 season, and his 2011 season, and his 2010 If things continued like Fernando Alonso's time at Ferrari, Vettel would be doing a lot of crying into the near future. Because after driving that car that would rather crash into the wall than go in a straight line, Fernando Alonso decided to leave Ferrari for McLaren at the end of 2014. And to save me from going through this each and every year we talk about, for the next 4 years, Fernando Alonso suffered through hell.
The engine was going much slower than before. Amazing. There is something wrong with the car. It's pulling to the left. Something on the suspension maybe. Mate, I have no brakes, no tires. We are out of the points.
His Honda engine must have been taken straight out of the Jazz, because it seemed to do 0 to 60 in 3 business days when compared to the other Formula 1 teams. And at the end of 2018, Fernando just straight up announced his retirement, which after driving that, I can't blame him. Bye-bye, Nano. So 2017 rolled around and Lewis Hamilton had a brand new teammate, which was Valtteri Bottas. Think of Bottas as someone who was willing to play second fiddle and not fight Lewis Hamilton. Basically, he was the opposite of Nico Rosberg. However, Red Bull's Daniel Ricciardo didn't get the same treatment. He had a young fella named Max Verstappen right up his arse. Let me take you back to that funny moment where the Mercedes went boom.
Okay, Garmin. Video speichern.
Well, that race was also Max Verstappen's first ever race in the main Red Bull team, and he was just 18 years old. Since the Mercedes had finally f***ed off into the gravel, he actually had a chance to win it, and then he won it, making him, to this day, the youngest race winner ever.
You are the youngest person ever.
And making Daniel Ricciardo forever have nightmares about Sid the Sloth from Ice Age. By 2017, the rest of the pack were actually starting to catch back up to Mercedes, and Lewis's closest rival was Sebastian Vettel, who was now at Ferrari. But in 2017, despite Vettel putting a decent fight up, and Valtteri Bottas even coming into his own a little bit, Hamilton still quite comfortably won the championship, whereas 2018 seemed to be a bit more of a challenge for Mercedes. Arguably, 2018 was the closest Ferrari and Mercedes ever got. Vettel had a pretty good start to the season, winning 4 of the first 10 races, whereas Lewis was only able to win 3. And round 11 was set to be a great race for Vettel. It was the German Grand Prix. Vettel was a German, a chance to extend his lead in front of the home crowd. What an opportunity for him. Something that came honestly once in a lifetime, and he'd be doing it in the sport's most iconic team, Ferrari. He's in the wall, isn't he? He's in the wall.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
Sebastian Vettel crumbled under the pressure, and from there, Lewis Hamilton came into his own again, winning race after race after race after race. And of course, despite them looking like they had pretty good pace, Ferrari just kept being Ferrari, forgetting that to win races, you actually had to put something called a strategy together, and not send your driver out on the wrong tires during qualifying for the Japanese Grand Prix.
Strategia. Francesco needs no strategy.
Yeah, so in the end, Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, they won that one too, by quite a large amount, actually, at the end of the season. And then they won 2019 with not too much competition. But after a series of mistakes Vettel had made in 2018, Ferrari were beginning to question if he was really the right leader of the team going forward. And a young rookie from 2018 had shown some real promise. For 2019, Charles Leclerc was promoted from Sauber into the Ferrari seat. An opportunity anyone in motorsport would relish, never mind someone who just had their rookie season a year before. As soon as he got to the depressing red team, he showed us that maybe it wasn't so depressing after all.
He won in Spa! He wins in Monza! Charles Leclerc is the winner!
And by the end of the year, Leclerc had thwarted Vettel by 24 points in his first year. Getting a bit of a flashback here. But not only that, he won back-to-back races at Spa and Monza. And winning at Monza, the Italian Grand Prix, in a Ferrari is like the Italian equivalent of an American guy eating 100 hot dogs in less than 5 minutes in the middle of Texas. It's true patriotism. The entire country went crazy, adopted this young Monegasque Basque kid as one of their own, mostly because a driver hadn't been able to win the Italian Grand Prix with Ferrari since Alonso left. You know what that means? All that time, Sebastian Vettel, he hadn't managed to do it. And so as 2019 came to a close, the beginning of the end was in sight for Vettel. And lo and behold, the end did happen a few years later. He went from dominating at the start of the decade to being pushed out in favor of new talent. Which of these seasons was the best then? Because overall, the 2010s is one of the more boring eras in Formula One. Red Bull and Mercedes very much dominated the championships, while Ferrari always struggled to clutch their wins. The fight between Rosberg and Hamilton was definitely a top-tier moment, and one of the greatest rivalries the sport's ever seen. But if you're going to go back and watch any of these years, it has to be 2012. Not only was the championship down to the wire between Fernando and Seb, with both of the drivers at pretty much peak performance, but to this day, that entire 2012 grid remains one of the most talented lineup of drivers we have ever seen in Formula One. You had Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Raikkonen, Nico Rosberg, and Jenson Button, who either were all or would go on to be world champions in their career. And the 2012 season opened with 7 different race winners in 7 races. One of those being Pastor Maldonado, who was driving for Williams and usually crashed his car midway through the race. But at the 2012 Spanish Grand Prix, he somehow managed to win, and his car was so surprised it hadn't exploded mid-race, it decided to set itself on fire afterwards. If you did enjoy this look back, please do consider subscribing, and also let me know in the comments if there's anything you wish I would have talked about. Obviously, it's a lot to try and cram into one video. Thanks again to my channel members. You guys are amazing, and I really appreciate the support. Goodbye!